number of police officers arrived at the property after receiving a series of quiet 911 calls from a rural Texas ranch one afternoon in 1994. What they discovered upon entering via the front entry shocked them to their core and left them wondering what killed Olivia Mabel. One of the worst things a loving parent may experience is the loss of a kid. Losing something so unique and joyful would be a mother's and father's worst nightmare. The tragedy of burying one's own child frequently leads to lifelong depression, and in many cases suicide for those who bear the brunt of this type of heartbreak. They end up living in a world of memories that they can no longer recreate, torturing themselves inside the walls of a prison from which they are unable to escape. It is a journey that is far too painful to undertake, leaving them feeling hopeless, alone, and on the verge of self-destruction. Back in March of 1990, this very misfortune descended upon a household located in Salina, Texas. The Footlights Ranch, a 13-acre property situated about an hour north of Dallas, was owned by Travis and Olivia Mabel. They had relocated there in 1983, shortly after Olivia had given birth to their son Aiden as a happily married couple. They hoped in purchasing a larger home to extend their small family. Although during those first years they doted heavily on their only child on the afternoon of the 13th of March, a 7-year-old Aiden had asked his mother if he could go off and play in the sprawling grounds surrounding the ranch. She had of course agreed, as she did so every day on the proviso that he was back in time for his dinner. Aiden had whooped and cheered as he set off on yet another boyhood adventure, and Olivia didn't see him for the rest of the afternoon by 5:30 p.m. that evening. However, he had still not returned, even though his dinner was sat on the table going cold. Both parents set out to look for him, thinking he was probably having too much fun and had simply lost track of time. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of the situation. Not far from the house, they discovered Aiden floating, face down in a pond where he had fallen and drowned. Travis and Olivia were devastated by the loss of their son, and regrettably, their relationship was not strong enough to handle the heartache and pain they both experienced. They blamed each other and themselves, and they were both overcome with guilt that would never go away. Olivia withdrew into herself, rarely left the house, stopped going to her local church, and started to isolate herself from her friends, family, and eventually even her husband. The couple divorced the following year, and Travis moved east to start over. Olivia, on the other hand, decided to stay at the ranch and live alone and in isolation, encircled by the 13 acres of wildness that were part of the home. Other than a fleeting sighting by a neighbor in late 1991, no one ever saw or heard from Olivia again. When the Salina Police Department received a 911 call from an unknown source on February 27, 1994, the operator who answered heard only silence on the other end before the line clicked and eventually cut off after a couple of minutes, as procedure dictated. The police department then started to trace the call, but soon after the phone rang a second time and the operator was met with the same eerie silence. In other words, phone calls and letters went unanswered. Visitors to the house were ignored, except for the groceries she had delivered, and people started to question whether she still lived there. And all 3 calls were made from the same number. All of them silent, and all of them traced the same address, the Footlights Ranch. The home of Olivia Mabel. A patrol car was sent to check on the house, but the police officers found that it was completely locked down. They couldn't see through any of the windows, which were whitewashed, and the front door had not been used in so long that it had swelled and bowed outwards into the doorframe so that it was jammed shut, thinking that someone could be in distress. The police officers broke open the front entrance and entered the stricken home, and what they found defied all logic. The interior of the house was in a serious state of neglect, with layers of dust piled upon the furniture and cobwebs. Infesting every crack, corner, and crevice, each room looked as though it had not been touched in years, let alone lived in. And this was the same scene that greeted the officers as they explored the rest of the household. That was until they reached what had once been Aiden's room inside. They found all of his clothing and toys stored neatly away in drawers and cupboards. Everything was pristine and tidy. No dust, no cobwebs. It had all been perfectly well kept. In the center of the room they found Olivia Mabel in a nightgown and slippers sitting in a rocking chair. Deceased, clutched in her hands, was a small doll made in her son's image, wrapped in pieces of his clothing. reported that it looked as though she had been dead for a couple of months. In front of her was a makeshift altar made in Aiden's honor, decorated with candles, fresh flowers, and her late son's possessions, as well as photographs and drawings of him amongst his toys. They found heartbreaking letters written by a grieving mother to her lost son. Needless to say, it was quite upsetting for those present, but there was a question which hung bleeding in the air like an open wound: who had made the 911? Santiago was. One of the first officers on the scene explained what they discovered that day. Only the front door, where the police had entered, showed evidence of forced entry, and there was no indication that anyone else had visited or entered the property. All doors and windows were locked from the inside, and even the phone had a layer of dust on it that showed no signs of being lifted to make the call. If that wasn't strange enough, things got even stranger when an officer looked at one of the letters, which was clearly written by Olivia. The exact words were as follows: "My assistant, I'm leaving because I shouldn't have let things to get this bad. You disgusting, horrible creature, Mama's coming for you, Aiden." The fact that this letter was dated February 27, 1994, both perplexed and unsettled investigators. "My dear Aiden, your mother loves you." Given the police's entry into her home on the day her body was discovered, additional concerning evidence suggested that Olivia may have been experimenting with occult practices. The makeshift altar dedicated to Aiden had several characters written in Sanskrit that, when translated, were found to spell, construct, or build. Given the altar's obsession with Sanskrit isolation, it is thought that Olivia was attempting to create a tulpa or thought form. Lastly, the doll that was discovered clutched in her hand could be considered a reasonable assumption. It's possible that Olivia was using her unending sadness to create an entity in the likeness of her son. Given her desperation and intense emotional state, could Olivia have created a being of pure thought? Based on her letter dated February 27th, could this being have slipped the shackles of her control and turned against her, possibly taking her life in the process? Tibetan Buddhism provides some insight into this practice by stating that a being can be created through pure spiritual or mental discipline and powerful concentration of thought. It is challenging to explain several parts of this case without taking into account the paranormal, as Francesca specifically mentions that she and the other officers felt a strong, furious presence hovering over the family when they arrived. The current owner, Christopher Hagen, has been unable to sell the property, and it has remained empty for almost 25 years. Perspective. Buyers are apparently put off by the oppressive atmosphere they feel upon entering the home. Christopher himself reported multiple paranormal occurrences during renovation work and beyond. In 2005, he invited Austin-based paranormal investigator Drew Navarro to visit the property. Navarro claimed that out of the hundreds of locations he has studied, he has never felt such an imposing force, and went on to report how he could not breathe upon entering the home. He described feeling a constant shifting energy which behaved erratically like a jealous child throwing a tantrum, and that at no point did it feel inviting. He finished by saying the house should be avoided and a serious intervention is needed, as he didn't quite know what he was dealing with. So what killed Olivia Mabel? Did she die of a broken heart? Or was there something far more sinister at work? Before we make any assumptions, allow us to consider the alternatives. It is possible that someone entered the house, wrote the letter, and called the police. But since there was no evidence of forced entry, and the house and phone had not been disturbed for months, we are led to wonder if this entire incident actually happened. For example, there is a death certificate for 7-year-old Aiden Mabel that lists both Travis and Olivia as his parents, but amateur investigators have not discovered one for his mother. In addition, there is no coroner's report that explains the cause of Olivia's death. Furthermore, there are no online news articles about the strange circumstances in which her body was discovered. One would think that the local press would have at the very least jumped on such a strange story, as they did in the Christopher case back in 1991. Ultimately, as far as we can tell, news of this odd case only began to surface a few years ago. This was around the same time that a Kickstarter campaign was started to raise money for a film called Thinking Form, which was based on the events surrounding Olivia Mabel's death. Many critics point to this as a blatant example of viral marketing, which is something that many movie studios use in this fantastic modern era of the internet. But despite how suspicious all of this may sound, nothing is clear. The lack of evidence of a fake does not imply that a death certificate for Olivia Mabel does not exist. Whether or not this story is true, it is out there, and Whether it is true or not, it is sad enough to make you cry and eerie enough to give you the chills. If it is fictional, then it has done its job as a work of art by making the viewer, listener, or reader feel at least something. If it is true, however, then we can only hope that Olivia has finally been reunited with her beloved Aiden, and that they both rest in eternal peace together. Her family may have wanted to keep her death out of the media, but the fact that a couple of opportunistic filmmakers decided to make a movie out of it does not mean the entire situation is part of a cunning marketing campaign.